Guys, listen. Remember, we're talking about how we're going to incorporate these things into essays, okay? If you ever write an essay about the American form of government, the Republican form of government, okay, this is the secret. The secret to an American form of government is compromise. That's what Madison was saying in Federalist number 10. It was the intentions of the Founding Fathers, okay? Everything that we have, including the bedrock of our government, the Constitution, is a compromise, okay? So this is an important thing to get in mind, to keep in mind. I think we said this several times in class. With all the trials and travails and problems America has been through over the years, there's only been one time when we could not compromise ourselves out of a problem. And the problem was slavery. Okay, and the result was 700,000 people dead because of the Civil War. So that shows you how important compromise is. And if you remember, leading up to the Civil War, everybody was trying to compromise everything in sight. Okay, so this is pretty much the secret to the Republic. Okay, does everybody get so? All right, first thing we're going to talk about. Okay, this is why America has to have compromise. Guys, we told you guys this in class. One thing to always try to put into an essay, if you can find a place, is James Madison in Federalist number 10. It's an absolute work of genius. It's very applicable to almost any subject because it talks about factions. Okay? And anytime you have a free society, any type of free society, as long as people can form their own opinions, there will be factions. That's just the rule of the road. Okay? So again, this is a quote by Madison. You don't have to write this down, but this is a quote by him, okay? And he said, as long as men have the liberty to develop thought, opposite passions will emerge. He's talking about people who are passionate about one thing, okay? The Republican form disallows the dominance of extreme in favor of the healthy medium to the benefit of society. What Madison's saying right here, whoops, hang on, get back up. All right. What Madison's saying right here, as long as people, and God, this is an important thing, as long as people have the freedom to think, okay, you're going to form different opinions, okay? There are numerous factions in this room right now, okay? And as long as you have factions and people are passionate about these things, okay, you had better find a way for everybody to coexist. If you don't find that way, then liberty will not exist. Okay? So this is something extremely important to keep in mind. Okay? It will come in very, very handy when you're writing essays and things like that. It's the essence of our government. Okay? Everybody good? All right. The first section is going to be the Constitutional Convention. Okay? When we started putting down the bedrock for our government, the owner's manual for our government, okay, pretty much the entire Constitution is a compromise. It's a compromise recognizing the fact of what Madison said. Guys, think about this for a second. Okay, remember, we're always talking about context. Okay? The context for compromise at the Constitutional Convention was the colonial nature of the colonies. Look at all the factions you had. You had Southern faction, Northern faction, you had religious factions, all of these type of things. No one is going to sit down in Philadelphia and all get on the same page for the same reason. Everybody has their own self-desires and things. And that's why the Constitution had to be a compromise. Okay? So, because of this, this is the first one. And what I did on these, I wrote the compromise down. I put the year, which you may or may not want. It's just not a sign point. But I put what the compromise was about. This is the subject of the compromise. This is about representation. If you're going to have a democratic society, the Republican form, and remember guys, a Republican form of government is when people elect people to represent them. Okay? If you're going to do that, you've got to have some parameters about who gets elected and who represents. And that's what's going to happen here. Okay? And I know this is kind of stirring stuff that you're probably familiar with, but this was the argument. Okay? Upon what criteria do you base representation? Okay? Are you going to base it on the population of the large states? Okay? Well, if you do, then states like Delaware and Rhode Island, who have a population of about 4.5, okay, if you do like that and everything, these people will never be able to have their desires presented in Congress. They'll always be outvoted. Okay? So the opposition to that, if you're a small state, you can't compete with the population, so every state should have the same. It should be equal across the board. Okay? So this is the dilemma that's facing the delegates in Philadelphia. Okay? How do you deal with that? Guys, think for a second. Is there anything you can think of that would have worked that would not have been a compromise? That's kind of the point here, okay? They knew what they had to do, but guys, always remember this. The toughest thing about being any type of public official, okay, is trying to please everybody. Danica can tell you that. She's probably had experience of this. You can't make everybody happy at the same time. You got to give a little, got to take a little. And that's the essence of compromise, okay? Did I turn this thing off? Well, there it goes.
There we go.
Okay. This is how they decided to do it. The word bicameral means two houses. You're going to have two houses in your lawmaking body. The first house, of course, this is the people's house, okay, is the one based on the concept of the large states, population, okay? The House of Representatives is known as the people's house. It's the house that's supposed to represent the will of the people. And because of that, the number of representatives you have in Congress is based on population.
So what do they have to do, or what do they do to figure out what states' populations are? Because they change. Do you know what they do every 10 years? There you go.
Yeah, they do. And they'll go back and they will realign lines and things like that.
That's why
Okay?
it's always a big deal when a census comes out, and why they'll go to people's houses, because
You
they
ever heard
have
of
to make sure.
gerrymandering? Yeah, that happens sometimes. This happens. If you want to have representation from a certain group, they'll take these districting lines and they'll make all kind of crazy things out of it. Okay? One thing to think about here, keep this in mind. This is going to be, it's called the lower house because on the status scale, the people are down below the elites, okay? But if this is the people's house, there are certain things that only the people themselves can determine. One of them is money. This is a big deal. All money bills that come out of Congress originate in the House, and that involves taxes, okay? That's important. It's called the power of the purse, okay? That's the great advantage that the House has over the Senate. Nothing can come out of Congress involving money, expenditures, taxation, unless it originates in the House. Okay? Everybody good? Okay. The other one, of course, is the Senate. Okay? It's important to understand and remember that when the Constitution was drafted, senators were chosen by state legislatures. They were not popularly elected. That won't happen until Woodrow Wilson. Okay? So, the Senate is the upper class. It's named after the Roman Senate. Okay? And these people were chosen. This is the elite. These are the elitists. The ones that supposedly know more because they're educated. They know more because they're successful businessmen. So you've got two houses, and guys, listen carefully. Think about what this represents. That's the pyramid. You remember the pyramid we've been drawing all year long? That's it. Okay? This is the very top of the pyramid, and this is the bottom. If you wanted to say cavaliers and yeomen, you could say that. So again, the compromise, the Great Compromise is going to reflect the American demographic. Okay? Everybody good? Everybody good so far? Okay? It's important.
Do you know why they chose the number of House Representatives at 435, where that number came from?
Nope. Okay. My
No-
guess is
no
because
one has
when the
answered that for
population
me.
grows, it increases, obviously, so it kind of comes and goes. Because it obviously wasn't that, at the beginning. But you always know what's going to be in the Senate. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Is everybody good so far? Okay. All right. This is the next compromise in the Constitution. And of course, the subject of this one is still representation, but this one involves slaves. Important thing to write down in an essay, right? Guys, slavery was present there at the beginning. And we're not talking about the presence of the institution of slavery. We're talking about slavery as a political issue. Please, whatever you do, and guys, we've talked about this before, never lose sight of the fact that the spread of slavery was the predominant issue, not the existence of slavery. Okay? Current attitudes at that time accepted slavery. It had been in the Western Hemisphere since Pedro Cabral put it there in 1500. So the existence of African slaves was there. And whether it was distasteful to people, it didn't really bother anybody. Guys, if you're in the North and you're trying to build an industrial society like that, slaves are out of sight, out of mind. You don't see them, you don't hear them, So they're just there. It's just a necessary evil. But the minute you try to put the institution of slavery into your government, the minute you start giving slaveholders advantage, then it becomes an issue. Always remember that. That's a big, big deal to remember. Okay, I can't tell you how many essays I've read in the past when I was a reader for AP where people get that wrong. Okay? Slavery will not become a political issue until it starts to spread. And guys, when it spreads, that means it has to increase. And when it increases, that gets to be an issue. Okay? So the question is, if you're the southern states, look at what you know. You know that the northern states will always increase their population by immigration. Okay? The South has no immigration. Nobody's immigrating to come to the South. Okay? So if you want to maintain a balance in this bicameral legislature, Southerners want to count their slaves as representation. Okay? And you guys know what happened. The North said, no slaves. Just free white people. The South said, we want to count every one of our slaves. Okay? So if you do that, the medium was 3. So 3/5 of a person is counted for representation in the South when you're talking about slaves. That's what the 3/5 compromise is. And guys, from the perspective of now looking back, remember I told you back then that was going to be an explosive issue? Everything that went through the antebellum period, everything that went right up to the firing of Fort Sumter was based on the spread of slavery. If you're the South, you have to have that to maintain a balance in the legislature. So you will always adopt the 3/5 compromise and hold it up to you as to be what you think is your shield against the tyranny of the North. Okay, so everybody gets simple. Okay, so we talked about there. All right, talk about that. Okay, has everybody got these 2 things? These are basic things you kind of need to know. Okay. Eventually, the 3/5 compromise will become ineffective. Okay. In the 1840s, when you start to see Irish immigration after the Great Famine, after the potato famine, okay, there are so many immigrants coming in, there are more immigrants than there are slaves coming in. Okay? By that time, this next one we're going to talk about is kicked in. There is no more Atlantic slave trade. Okay? So Southerners, if they want slaves, they have to create their own through domestic breeding, pretty much. Okay? That is a slow, meticulous process, and it cannot keep up with the amount of immigrants. So the 3/5 compromise will finally start to tail off because of the onslaught of immigration. But by that time, we're dealing with things like the Compromise of 1850. Okay, so it will shift. Okay, all right. This is the next one, and this is also about slavery, but this is about the slave trade. When you go to college, if you ever get a chance, there are 2 classes you should take. You should take African American history and you should take women's history. Okay? Because these are 2 areas that high schools are woefully neglectful in. Okay? The only reason we get to talk about the way we do is because it's AP. Okay? But one thing about this, when you study the history of slavery, it is the most frustrating thing in the world. Because when you read about it in America, what you read about is this. As far as the institution, nobody really had a problem with it. They had a problem with the spread of it, and even more than that, they had a problem with shipping them overseas. Okay? That was a bigger issue than the institution of slavery. There was something evil in making your living enslaved. And that's what offended people's morality. So when the North agreed to let the South have their 3/5 compromise, this is what's called a quid pro quo. I give you something, you give me something. Okay? So what they got in return was a promise that the South would support a ban, okay, on the Atlantic slave trade by 1808. So that means, okay, South, if you want all these slaves that you're going to count for representation and you're going to get them overseas, you better start importing a ton of slaves because 1808, the game's over. The slave issues in the Constitution are the essence of compromise. The North is going to give the South their 3 compromise, and they're going to ask for an end to the slave trade, and they'll get it. That's a biggie. That's a huge one. Guys, the reason the North agreed to this is nobody expects slavery to last that long. It is a money-losing proposition, okay? As a labor force, it's becoming inefficient. All right? So because of that, the North doesn't mind this. We'll let them go ahead and get their slaves in 1808 because if they get a bunch of slaves and then they're inefficient, it's just a waste of money. So the assumption, or I should say the presumption, okay, that slavery is a dying entity as a labor force is why they agreed to this. What did they not count on? The cotton gin. The cotton gin changed everything. The cotton gin made slavery a money-making proposition. Okay, that was 1793. Okay? It's weird. When you think about these things, look at the effect that slavery had on this nation up to the Civil War. Look at the fact that the legacy of slavery is on our nation today. It's in the Civil War. Slavery is in our face almost every day. Okay? And the one thing that made it that way was the cotton gin. That's the one thing that made it economically feasible. Okay, is everybody? Okay.